Shannon's Lumber Industry Update.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. It's episode 131 and we're doing a featured species, Tamo Ash. This is a particularly interesting one and, well, I'll get into that in a little bit. But I've also got some questions on what's a tree and what's a shrub. We're going to talk a little bit about ray fleck and grades of ray fleck. And we're going to get into a listener who's written in who has a drying issue and a bug issue and foreshadowing possibly a mold issue. But what I really want to talk about with Tamo Ash this time is the fact that this is a species that is often cultivated and harvested for figure. And I've long wanted to do an episode about figured woods. And it's kind of a daunting topic because there's a lot we don't actually know about why figure presents the way it does. And the Tamo Ash can be a good example of that. So rather than getting too much in the abstracts of figure, I think over a couple of episodes, I'll be highlighting specific species that highlight specific types of figure. And we can talk about the possible hypotheses about why that figure exists. And we can start to extrapolate from there once we've talked about several different examples where figure comes from. You know, how can one cultivate figure? So look at this as episode 131, the Tamo Ash, Figured Woods, part 1, big old question mark. Anyway, thank you as always for tuning into the show, whether you're listening to the podcast in audio or watching it in video version on YouTube. If you don't know, I'm Shannon of Shannon's Lumber Industry Update. It occurs to me I've never actually introduced myself. A lot of people come to this show from Wood Talk, people who have come to me from my Renaissance Woodworker podcast that's been on YouTube for a long, long time. Some of you are members of the Hand Tool School and you know me that way. And a lot of you are like, who the heck is this, idiot who loves trees so much is talking about trees? I'm Shannon Rogers. I'm the host of this. I work for a lumber company, millwork company. I've been a woodworker for many, many years, and I just love trees and I love geeking out about the science of trees. So this show, it's all about your questions and filling you in on what's going on in the lumber industry, what's going on with trees, but not just trees as in let's hug the trees and let's talk about the natural forms of trees that are used for lumber. That's really what this show's about. So go to lumberupdate.com if you want to check out the notes from the past episodes, but also this is where you want to submit your questions. There is a form to submit your questions there. You also can hit me up on via email at lumberupdate@gmail.com or find me at lumberupdateshow on Instagram. You can submit messages that way as well. And of course, if you're one of the cool people who sponsor this show over on Patreon, that's patreon.com/lumberupdate, you can submit questions that way. And I'll be honest, they kind of get bumped to the top of the pile. I've got a lot of questions here. And again, thank you to the sponsors who submit questions. Thank you to the average Joe on the street who submits questions as well. It's what really kind of drives the format of the show. So that being said, let's get a little bit into some of the feedback that I've got from some previous episodes. I heard from John about last episode. I talked about coppicing, pollarding, and daisugi. And he sent me an email which was titled Accidental Coppice. Intriguing. That got me to open it. So he has a black locust that he says it was originally coppiced, if that's the proper past tense, I guess, to coppice. I coppiced. Sure. The original tree was cut down before I moved in. Then multiple shoots grew up around the stump. I cut all but one back. This was about 5 years ago. And what we're seeing in the image for those watching the video is this one shoot remaining. It's about 6 inches wide and 25 to 30 feet tall, maybe more. It seems to be growing extremely well, like it only has to grow one direction because the roots are already there. That's exactly right, John. That's why coppicing is an effective silvicultural method. There are multiple locusts around the lot, and despite their nasty thorns, I like them very much. Bonus that the leaves just seem to disappear after dropping. That is absolutely key. I have a sycamore with leaves like bigger than my head. They do not disappear, and I rake and rake and rake, and they never go away. I have a red maple with the same type of thing. Leaves just never go away. But black locusts, they're fantastic. I think honey locust does the same thing too. They just kind of crumble away into dust. So the image that I'm showing here is, you see a big stump and then, a sizable tree coming out of it. And this actually feeds a question that I fielded offline about if you're dealing with a species that does well with coppicing, but what if you don't want the tiny little shoots? What if you don't want 6 different shoots? Some people find it very ugly, and there are some species that I kind of agree with that. What you can do is adopt one of the shoots. Maybe look for the biggest one, the hardiest looking one, or just take a guess and cut all the other ones back, just like John did, and continue to cut back any additional shoots that come up. Eventually, what will happen is the tree will learn, it's going to stop compartmentalizing and scabbing over where you cut off those shoots, and it's going to put all its effort into that one shoot that you've embraced, that you've adopted, that you sing to at night to make it grow pretty. And this is what's happened. You don't necessarily have to coppice of species like black locust that's prone to this. And we talked about several of the species that are good for it. You can adopt one of them and grow another tree, and it will grow quite fast because, as we said, the root structure is already there. There's no time as a sapling putting down and building that structure. Moreover, that structure is what can also help hold the tree up during windstorms as it's relatively young. Certainly as it gets taller, the trunk does a lot of that, but the root structure helps there as well. And what did he say in his email? It was about 5 years ago. Yeah, 5 years ago. And what we're looking at is a tree that's 6 inches wide, so 6 inch diameter and 25 to 30 feet tall. That's a sizable tree. That's actually getting into the beginnings of a lumber-worthy tree. Now, I would let it go a little bit longer, but certainly there are species out there that are cultivated at this size. For very specific reasons. And they found that what happens is they get to this 6 inch diameter and then they kind of plateau out. And over the next 20 years, they might grow a couple more inches. So harvesting at an earlier age and leaving more time to grow back to 6 inches, in other words, increasing the turnover rate, becomes the silvicultural method for lumber producing trees, lumber intended trees. So this actually does answer a few of those questions. As I said, people have said, what if I don't want the multiple shoots? What if I just want one? Here is a case in point. And John, I'm so glad that you wrote in because it perfectly illustrates what happens when you decide to just embrace one of those shoots. Next little bit of feedback is from Chandler. Chandler is in South Dakota, and he was writing in about the cottonwood that I featured. He says, I started a small lumber mill in Sioux Falls, South Dakota about a year ago. After listening to your cottonwood episode and hearing that you were in my neck of the woods, I figured I'd chime in on one of our local woods. Now, I told you, cottonwood is not exactly well regarded. It's known by several names that are not friendly because of how it smells. It does not smell good. It smells a lot like urine. So it's known a lot to smell like cow manure also, and goes by other unmentionable names around here. As a sawyer, I've been trying to find a market for this wood that people usually just give away. There's a key point. You don't have to buy this stuff. People are like, please get rid of it. Take it down. I don't like it. I don't like all the cottony seeds. Get rid of this. So one notable market that Chandler says he's found is in axe throwing targets. There are axe throwing bars popping up everywhere. I don't know about you guys, but I see them all over in Maryland. And as I've traveled in some of these road trips, I see them in different parts of the world. I saw them in the Wisconsin Dells. Of course, the Dells have everything. They have a Ripley's Museum. They have an upside down castle. It's like Pigeon Forge. But of course, they had axe throwing. I saw axe throwing in Sioux Falls. I've seen axe throwing kind of all over the country. He says the cottonwood is soft enough to stick an axe in easily, but it has enough fiber so that it won't crack. I found many axe throwing establishments around that are happy to pay much more than the going rate for pallet wood. Maybe someone listening who is looking for ways to use this could reach out to their local axe throwing place. Yeah, that's really cool. Talk about a highly specific need. And because we are talking about a wood that is often characterized, I'm sorry, I hate this term, but as trash wood, this is something, this is a disposable thing. People are going to replace these axe throwing targets over time. And, you're bringing people in who've never touched an axe before. You want something that axe is going to stick into easily. And there's your sales pitch. You could do pallet wood. Well, pallet wood, who knows what that is, and it may or may not stick. It's also going to be relatively slim pickings. You're going to have to take the whole thing apart. This could be, straight from a log. You could saw slabs. You could saw cookies. Cookies would be the most efficient use here, and sell this off, 4, 5, 6, 20 cookies at a time to your local axe throwing place. And know then at about 3 weeks, I don't know what the turnover for axe targets is. We'll just say 3 weeks, they're going to need some more. And considering this stuff can be found anywhere and people are giving it away, that's pretty cool. And ultimately, I'll have some conversations in the future about starting a lumber business. I've got a few folks who want to talk to me about that. This is one of those perfect examples of understanding a niche market, understanding a niche product, and feeding that market. I guarantee you, nobody has really thought this through, and the axe target, axe bars, throwing bars, whatever, they may not know. Maybe they do, but really, really cool, Chandler. I'm so glad you wrote that in, because this is lumber industry at its finest. There is a market for every species, and that's why I don't like the term trash wood. It's just you haven't found the purpose for it yet. And you know what? Sometimes the purpose is firewood. Sometimes the purpose is mulch. But I'd like you to look a little bit deeper, and you might be surprised what you come up with. Moving on to some industry news. Now, I have gotten a lot of people who have sent this to me. If you go back to my episode on wood cell structure, we talked about secondary walls, and we talked about microfibrils. Well, this has been all over the news in tree geek circles. You're hardly going to find this on the ABC Nightly News or anything like that. This is a new tree. And they've just, not a new tree type. In fact, we've discovered that the tulip poplar, everyone's favorite poplar in North America, Laureatodendron tulipifera, is neither hardwood nor softwood. It is neither conifer or angiosperm. It is a different structure, and it comes down to that secondary wall structure and those microfibrils and how they're shaped. Now, there's a couple of articles that I've seen on this. The one that I'm featuring on the video right now is the New Phytologist, and it gets into a lot of pretty technical details. So if you enjoyed that cell structure episode that I did, there's a lot of this, and there's links to the scientific papers on this. I also found an article, more layman's term, on the Woodworking Network as well, that I can post a link to. That basically just says, why do we care? Maybe not. It's not really going to do much for us from a working property perspective, but what it does tell us is that the tulip poplar is quite unique. Sorry, I just modified unique. That's a grammatical pet peeve of mine. If it's unique, it can't be very unique. Sorry. If Matt Vanderlist is listening right now, he's smiling because of the grammatical things that he taught me. Anyway, the tulip poplar is actually quite a bit older than we might think. And we could find some of its origins back in the Silurian epoch, period, era. I can't remember the term that I'm supposed to use there. But anyway, there's a lot of really cool stuff. And more importantly, in this New Phytologist article, it does go into some of the stuff that I talked about in the cellular structure episode, and talks about how hemicellulose and cellulose can actually play into the structure of the tree, and how those microfibrils are different from one angiosperm to another. So very, very cool. Plus, just for the scientists out there, they go into detail about their experimental procedures and how they've determined that we have a third type of tree, a third type of dicot that is neither angiosperm nor conifer. And you know that I am saying this, I don't know that we've given it a name yet. Hardwoods, softwoods, and poplar. It may be in here in this article, and I'm just not seeing it because, frankly, there's a whole lot of fine print here. So if I find that later, I seem to remember that there wasn't really anything yet, and it may be too early on. Maybe they need to find some other examples of this, like second opinions, if you will. But still, kind of cool. There is a third type of tree out there. Is that cool? I don't know if that's cool. That just fits the totally geeky tone of this show, right? So let's move on to the featured species, Tamo Ash, Fraxinus mandshurica, or Japanese ash, Chinese ash, it's sometimes called. There was another one in there, Manchurian ash, of course. Tamo ash, Japanese ash, Manchurian ash, some places Chinese ash. There's also some Korean ash type things there as well. The point that I want to bring up about this before we get too deep into this is, yes, it is a specific species, but the species all by itself is not normally figured. straight grain normal Manchurian, let's just call it Manchurian ash. Straight grain Manchurian ash looks like white ash, looks like black ash, a little bit closer to black ash. If I were to pan down and move out of the way on the video, there's a workbench. Fortunately, there's too much crap on my workbench to make a difference, but it's all made out of white ash. And if you look at an unfigured piece of, air quotes here, Tamo ash, it's going to look like most of the ash that we know. It looks like a white version of oak. Very open, grainy, ring porous wood with large pores. And that's Manchurian ash or Japanese ash. When the figure, in this case known as peanut figure, is apparent on the tree, that's when we call it Tamo ash. So, well, I shouldn't say that. Tamo ash is still a unique species, right? It's still Fraxinus manchuria, which the more appropriate name for that would probably be Manchurian or Japanese ash. The Tamo name only comes up when you find it in figure. So you could have a beautiful, straight grain, typical ash looking board that is Manchurian ash and a figured one, and the commercial market would call one Tamo and one regular ash. Interestingly enough, I don't think I have any ash. I have some at my lumber shed. I don't have any in the shop right now, but I do have some veneer of Tamo ash. So if you're watching the video, this is what peanut figure looks like. If you're listening to this, go Google it. Go Google Tamo ash. You'll find lots of pictures of that peanut figure. Hand tool school members will remember I built a tall chest using Tamo ash as the veneer for the drawer fronts. And here's one of the drawers with a nice French polish on the surface. It's a heavily, heavily, heavily figured wood. And excuse me, broadcasting faux pas. I'm talking as I turn away from the microphone. The figure of it looks a lot, that peanut figure, the little kind of, call them bubbles, the little raised sections, that chichoincy that makes things kind of pop three-dimensionally. Those raised sections are kind of peanut shaped, and that's where that idea of peanut figure comes from. That is still not exactly quite understood what creates the peanut figure. A lot of people will say that it's because of the vines that grow on the tree that are tightly woven around the trunk. And as those vines grow and they tighten, the tree is forced to kind of bubble up in between those vines. And that's what would create this kind of almost bubble looking figure that you find in examples of veneer. And we should be clear to say that Tamo ash, again, Tamo means that it has the figure. Manchurian ash, totally different market, but Tamo ash is a veneer tree. It is cut and it is rotary sliced and it is guillotine sliced specifically for veneer. I have looked and I've looked and I looked to find like a board of Tamo ash, and I have not been able to find one. I built this tall chest for the hand tool school, I guess it was a couple of years ago now. And I went looking for Tamo ash in order to saw it into veneer and kind of include that as part of the lesson. And it was just impossible. But I could find veneer, like from veneer suppliers of Tamo ash without a problem. No problem whatsoever. It's not really endangered in that respect. There's lots of it. Think about ash in North America. It grows all over the place. However, in, let me get my facts straight here. In the... let's see, Japanese foresters. Oh, sorry. Before I go too much further away, it sought for its figure created by the vines tightly growing around its trunk. And Japanese foresters have tried to simulate that by wrapping ropes tightly around the trunk in order to cultivate the same figured effect. It's been successful, but kind of like when you try to intentionally distress a table, it looks like you intentionally stressed it. So the peanut figure they create kind of looks a little too uniform. It looks a little too intentional. It's not quite the same. Maybe you would buy some and you would think, it's okay. Without having seen the real stuff, you may not notice it. Harvesting of the ash, it can be a bit of a problem. And in places like Russia, specifically Russia, it's been over harvested for the figure, and it is now a CITES Appendix 3 species. Now, Appendix 1 means no trade whatsoever, completely illegal to trade it unless it's for like scientific experiments, and then you need like a letter from God to basically trade it. Appendix 2 means it is in danger of becoming endangered. In danger, I-N-D-A-N-G-E-R. In danger, it is threatened of becoming endangered. It is not endangered. Please get that right, folks. We need to start thinking about, we need regulation in order to prevent it from becoming endangered. CITES Appendix 3 says that it is in danger of becoming endangered in a very specific geographic area. And in this case, a CITES party member appeals to the rest of the CITES Convention of Parties and says, I need help. I need to regulate Tamo Ash. So the Russian Federation, do I have the date? I don't. I didn't write down the date. So we'll just say sometime. The Russian Federation came to the Convention of Parties and said, Tamo Ash is being over-harvested in my region, in my range is how they refer to it. But it's being trafficked in so many different areas, I'm having trouble controlling it. So I want to come to the Convention of Parties and say, make it like a CITES 2, but just in my little region, just within the Russian Federation. And that's what Appendix 3 means. So as you leave the Russian Federation, as you move to Thailand, as you move to Japan, as you move to parts of China, now China's not a CITES member, so that data may be a little fake, but certainly in Japan, where a lot of our veneer, our Tamo Ash veneer comes from, it is not in danger of becoming endangered. It is sustainably harvested. The problem that has occurred in Russia, and that's why I want to go into this, is because they only want the Tamo Ash figure. They only want that peanut figure. But in many instances with figured trees, it's not immediately apparent when you look at the trunk. Some quilted maples, some bird's eye, you can actually see through the bark, but you can't really tell how much there's going to be. This can be particularly difficult because if in fact it is the vines causing it, the trunk is obscured by those vines. So you may go looking for a Manchurian ash tree that has vines around it, and you may cut that down and you don't know what the figure's like until you've cut it down and until you've sawn that log open or split that log open. And what happens in these markets is they go out and they start felling Manchurian ash trees, and they cut them open on the forest floor, like right there. And if there's no figure, or the figure's not acceptable enough or dense enough, they leave that tree on the forest floor to rot. They don't even bother to pull it out and saw it into boards because that's not what they want. They're not going to get what they think their money's worth or their goal in veneer because of that poorly figured or unfigured log. So they leave it there, and it's a complete waste of lumber. This extends to other markets where it's not necessarily figured, but the figure we're looking for. A perfect example of this is ebony, Gabon ebony specifically. There were guitar makers who wanted the all black fretboard. So the foresters, the harvesters, the lumberjacks would go out in the forest and they would fell an ebony tree. There's no way to tell if it's all black or if it has streaks of other color in it until you actually saw open that log. So they go and they fell this log and, oh, it's got streaks in it. No one's going to buy it. And they just left it there on the floor. That was horrible. And we had a real problem with ebony in that case. What it took was essentially a leader in the industry, in this case, Bob Taylor of Taylor Guitars, stepped up and said, you know what, I'm going to start using streaky ebony in my fretboards. I'm going to make it acceptable to not have jet black, all black. Because up until that point, absolutely unacceptable. If you had a slight streak or wasn't perfectly jet black, it was a defect. And the guitar didn't fetch as much. Bob Taylor said, this is stupid. We are wasting, like he visited a Gabon forest and there were just logs laying on the ground, like all over the place. There's a great video of Bob Taylor where he talks about this. This is probably back in 2011 or 2012. And he talks about it and he has video of just all these logs laying all over the place. And he was saying, well, what's wrong with these logs? And he said, the people cutting them down were saying, well, no one will buy them. It's like, what do you mean no one will buy them? Well, we've brought them to market before. And if there's the slightest little streak, they don't buy it. Moreover, they're not going to buy it in log form. They're going to buy it in board form. So it's these foresters that say, we take it back. We go to all the effort of sledging this out of the forest and then sawing it into boards. And then the luthiers come and they grade it and they out everything, and they take maybe 1% of the entire log, and it's not worthwhile. So what they started doing is cutting them open in the forest and just walking away from the stuff that was streaky. That's what's happening with Tamo Ash. Well, Bob Taylor, because Taylor Guitars has a little bit of weight to throw around, and some of his buddies got together with the other guitar manufacturers and said, this is stupid, guys. Like, we can set the trend. From a design perspective, if Taylor Guitars starts including streaky or like Macassar figured ebony in our fretboards, and we say it like because we're doing this from an environmental perspective, yeah, it's going to catch on. And guess what? You go into a guitar store now, certainly you're going to still see jet black fretboards, but you're also going to see some streaky ebony fretboards. Moreover, you're going to see fretboards that are not made from ebony. They're made from other species, from rosewoods and blackwoods and other things like that may or may not be more sustainably harvested. In other words, it's taken some of the pressure off that ebony market. So the CITES 3 listing is specifically targeting that type of forestry practice for Tamo Ash in the Russian Federation. From what I've read, from what I've looked at in the various lists, and certainly going through CITES and talking to some of my own contacts in the import world, the Japanese, a lot of Southeast Asia, where some of the Tamo Ash veneer is coming from now, have figured out ways to, well, let me put it this way. When they cut a tree down, they take the figured parts, and the part that's not figured, they still use it. In fact, Manchurian ash is kind of like white ash or black ash here in North America. It's a very commonly used species, used for, cabinetry and construction, and just like you would normally expect. So in my little sticker that I've thrown up on my screen here, I list common uses as primarily a veneer species with rotary cuts as the most efficient method to get the most use out of the veneer. Some slice cuts can be available in a flitch form where you want the whole thing. That's generally in a smaller, narrow diameter tree. But the regular grain, the unfigured stuff, is used just like common ash as a construction trade, cabinetry, etc., all over the place. One little thing about the Tamo Ash is actually an upgraded dashboard in a Bentley. So for you Bentley drivers out there, because I'm sure we have a lot of them listening to this show, when it says Tamo Ash as your upgrade, that's this is the peanut figure that you're talking about, and that's where that stuff comes from. So from a technical properties perspective, it's ash. Hardness of about 1,000-ish on the Janka scale. It can be a little bit harder to a little bit lower. MOR is almost identical to black ash. In fact, I sometimes wonder if the numbers that I found are just somebody saying it's black ash, because there's not that much of a difference. And considering the primary market for this is in veneer, you take a species that's known for veneer and you will not find hardness well, you'll find some hardness, but you won't find like bending strength or stiffness or any of that stuff, because no one cares. They're sawing it in 1/10 of an inch. But, 10,000, 11,000 for an MOR, about 1.2 million for the MOE. Movement perspective, TR ratio of 1.6. Again, very difficult to find these numbers. I had to dig into a CD-ROM. First, I had to find my plug-in CD-ROM drive in order to read this old Woods of the World CD-ROM. That was where I found tangential 7.8, radial 5%, and a 1.6 TR. Couldn't find that anywhere else because, again, it's a veneer species. It's not really known for that. The weight I guessed at 0.56 density and 35 pounds per cubic foot. I'm taking that directly from black ash. But when you look at the in-grain of Manchurian ash and black ash, and you look at a lot of similarities in structure, it is almost identical. And what you're going to find is the straight grain Manchurian ash is going to look like normal ash. I tend to think that it's got a little bit more of a greenish cast to it, but it's hard to tell since I haven't seen a piece like straight grain in person, if that was just the photography that was making it look a little bit green. Certainly as a Tamo Ash veneer, there is no green in this whatsoever. And if you're watching the video right now and you're seeing green, that's because the light right over here has a slight greenish hue to it. Anyway, so this is one of those species that we want to talk about where it grows unfigured, but its market is as a figured wood, and it's been given a specific market name, Tamo Ash, as that figured species. How this remains sustainable is using the whole buffalo. When you cut down a tree and you don't find figure in it, don't leave it on the forest floor. You use that And if you don't, this goes back to this cottonwood feedback. If there isn't a market for it, you need to find a market for it, because that is an incredibly unsustainable way of harvesting. It's like playing the lottery. You are going to lose 99.9999999% of the time if that's what you're doing, is just cracking a log and hoping to find a figure. And the other part, and this again is why the vine's tightly wrapped around the tree, again, no one can prove this scientifically yet, but why it's like we're pretty positive, is you can cut down a Manchurian ash and you'll see a section where there's vines on it and you'll find that figure in there. But then the rest of the tree, so say you've like bucked it into 6-foot sections. Well, the butt section may have no figure at all. And there'll be figure in that middle section where just the vines were, and then no figure in the other part. And if what they were doing is cutting that tree, cutting out that middle 6-foot section, carrying that out and leaving the rest of it on the forest floor, very, very bad. So this is something we're going to continue to revisit as we look at other examples of figure and other examples of figured species that have their own market. What are those harvesting practices? Is the entire tree still being used for something else, or is that market so niche that they're throwing it away? In which case, my recommendation is don't support that market at all. As beautiful as the Tamo Ash veneer is, and as much as I love building a piece of furniture out of it, and how happy I am that I still have some sheets left, if I thought that's how it was being done all over the world and somebody wasn't trying to correct that, granted, Russia's a little persona non grata right now, but they are a CITES party member, and that CITES listing has been there for a while. So there is some action to kind of correct that. Just take a look at that. The veneer world, the one thing I can say about it is it gets a lot of scrutiny, because frankly, what's sawn into veneers? It's usually really crazy exotic type woods that maybe don't grow that big, and they are truly tried to maximize the yield by sawing into tiny little sheets of veneer. Well, that is just ripe for illegal logging, for unsustainable practices, for shady doings. And the CITES Convention, the Lacey people, the U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife, all the governing bodies, the EUTR, the European Trade Union, essentially, European Timber Regulation. EUTR? Oh my God, I just forgot what that means. Basically, U.S. Fish and Wildlife for the European Union. All of these governing bodies, all these regulatory bodies, they like the first thing they do is look at the veneer suppliers and the veneer users. So anytime you've seen a Lacey violation or a Lacey shutdown or seizure, I think there's been one example of a flooring company, which is somebody else to look at, but they've all been guitar manufacturers using this veneer who didn't have their chain of custody right. Now, flooring is another one where you'll find, because lower grades, number 2 common is like the best grade in flooring because they only need one face and they generally have narrow and short links anyway. Sometimes there's a lot of stuff that can be mixed into that, and you can get away with weird tertiary, quaternary species that may not have proper provenance and might actually be a protected species locally and therefore becomes a Lacey violation. So I'm going a bit on a tangent there. I don't want to go into Lacey Act too much because, well, there's a lot to talk about there. And I've done an episode on that before. But the first lesson to take away from our figured wood species series is pay attention to how much of the tree is figured, what happens to the rest of the tree. Ask those questions. Look it up. Try to figure it out. Make sure there's a market for it somewhere else. Okay. Let's move on to some questions. I have a question from Mark. He says, what is the difference between a shrub and a tree? I thought it was basically the species. However, look at mesquite. Here in central and northern New Mexico, it grows a few feet tall. And if a shrub in eastern New Mexico and Texas, and is a shrub, looks like a shrub, I should say. In eastern New Mexico and Texas, the mesquite is a small tree up to 6 inches diameter and 20 feet tall. However, I've seen some boards from a mesquite tree from Mexico that was 12-inch wide and at least 20 feet tall. Is there official definition between a shrub and a tree? So, the height. Trees are typically at least 12 to 13 feet tall, while shrubs are less than 13 feet. The stem, or the trunk. Trees have one main trunk, or stem, that supports secondary branches. Think of your typical tree. Think of your child's drawing of a tree. While shrubs have multiple stems that emerge from near the ground. So does that make a coppiced black locust now a shrub? No, because it is still a locust. But you can imagine that would be quite confusing. If you didn't know what coppicing was and you saw something that had already been coppiced and was well established, you would look near the ground and you would see a bunch of stems and you might think it is. If you look a little closer, though, you will see those stems are sprouting out of a central stem or a central trunk that was cut close to the ground. That is the primary biological, taxonomic difference. Multiple stems versus one stem. Trees have one stem, shrubs have multiple stems. The other thing you can say is trees have branches that grow from the trunk to form a crown, while shrubs have branches that grow from the ground level to form a crown without a stem. And it's basically a different way of saying the second point, one central stem versus many stems. The crown is part of those individual stems. Those stems coming up are not really branching out too much. They're usually going straight up. If they branch out, it's usually lower down underneath things. Think of a boxwood. Boxwoods are often topiary and they're shaped into, a lollipop. But if you cut back that just skin deep layer of boxwood, there will be no leaves underneath it. The crown is formed by those stems going straight up. So while there may not be an exact rule to distinguish the two, David Allen Sibley, who's actually an ornithologist, but he's written the book. I've talked about Sibley's Guide to Trees before. He basically just says, if you can walk under it, it's a tree. If you have to walk around it, it's a shrub. So there's the anecdotal versus the somewhat scientific answer on that. Continuing on the figured thought here, Ben wrote in and he said, I'd like to start dabbling with craftsman style furniture, but I've never bought quarter sawn white oak. Is there a grading system or way for the industry to describe the amount of ray flecking in a board? I'd like to be able to speak the language as much as possible on a lumber yard. He says, P.S. Your lumber grading episode made me much more confident when talking to the guys at my lumber yard. Thank you in advance. Thank you, Ben. I appreciate that. I aim to inform so that you can look cool with your lumber friends. So the short answer to this is no. There is no grading system for ray fleck, not only in white oak or any species. What you have are lumber yards that deal in white oak, usually all shapes, sizes, and grains, quartered, rift, flat. Then you have lumber yards that may specialize in quartered. And sometimes they will say it's got a lot of ray fleck, or it's got medium ray fleck, or it's got a little bit of ray fleck. And that's it, really. There is no grade A, grade B, or, plus or whatever. It's just, that's got a lot of ray fleck, or it's got a medium amount. It's entirely an opinion more than anything else. Now, what you can say is, in general, the ray fleck in oak is if it's a quartered piece, a truly quartered piece where growth rings are at 90 degrees to the face, you're going to have a lot of ray fleck. What tends to make the ray fleck go to medium or lower is you're not quite unquartered. And I think that's really where the lack of a grading system, that's where that comes from, because you could change, if there were a grade for the amount of ray fleck, you could change that grade simply by orienting the grain a little bit differently. Having that grain, instead of straight on, dead on at 90 degrees, it could be at 80 degrees. And if you look at a board that has growth rings at 80 degrees to the face, you will see that the ray fleck is a little bit sparser. More importantly, the rays themselves are not quite as fat. Whereas dead on quartered, you've got these big fat rays, and they tend to kind of run across the grain. As you move into a more radial, 80, 75, 70 degrees, that ray fleck will become a little bit smaller and less consistent. So there's the thing. If you're looking for, and why do we want to grade, right? Because you want to be able to go to the yard and say, I want FAS. I want 80-20 FAS cherry. I want all heart, maple, or I should say all sap maple, because they sell maple for the white sapwood, not the brown heartwood. You want to walk the walk. You want to quickly get to what you want. Well, what you need to do is go to the lumberyard and say, I want true quarter sawn white oak. I want, no less than a 5% deviation from vertical. And they may look at you like, yeah, good luck, buddy. Go ahead. There's the stack over there. Dig through it. That's probably what they're going to say. But most lumber yards are going to store their boards slotted into the wall, so you're looking at the end grain. Now, there may be paint on the end, and that can be a bit of a problem. And what you're going to want to do is say, look, I need to be able to see this end grain. And that's generally, like, a lot of magazines will talk about bringing a block plane along. That is one of those things you might get away with that. Just make sure you ask before you start planing the paint off. But if you look at the end grain and you see 90 degrees growth rings to the surface, that's going to have a lot of ray fleck to it. So it's less of a grade and more of why does the ray fleck exist? Which brings up the next point. Is ray fleck figure? I would say no. If I were to define figure is kind of, we'll just define figure as like an abnormality in the growth. Ray fleck that's as textbook growth as it gets. All trees have medullary rays. All trees will present medullary rays if sawn radially. But the medullary rays will present differently from species to species. In other words, they'll be larger, smaller, closer, tighter space, all that fun stuff. So no, it's not a grade. It's just a part of how the tree grows. Good question. And honestly, I had to do some double checking with my white oak buyer on that to make sure, because I have seen people saying, oh yeah, this has, high amount of grade. Oh, the other thing I'll say is that's where like the made up grades come in. It's got superior fleck. I've sold superior grade walnut. There is no superior grade walnut, but FAS just doesn't do it justice. So we call it superior. It's not hyperbole because it is true. It is truly outstanding grade walnut, but you got to call it something. If I call it FAS, well, it's going to go for the market price for FAS. This stuff is all heart, absolutely gorgeous, 100% clear. We're calling it superior, which is why it's $3, $4 more a board foot than the FAS market price. So amount of ray fleck can be like that. This board's got a hell of a lot of ray fleck, so I'm going to charge $1 more a board foot for it. Although honestly, with the quartersawn white oak market right now, it's probably going to be $2 less a board foot than the rest of the stuff because nobody wants the quartered anymore. Funny how the times have changed. Okay. This is from Joshua. He actually submitted multiple questions here. And Joshua, I appreciate your patience for me to answer this. But this is something that I get a lot. I've talked about drying before. We talked to people who dry their own lumber. Joshua lives in central PA. So similar climate to me, hot and humid in the summers, cold and dry, but still kind of humid in the winters. He says, I've air dried some walnut among some other species, and I find that outside I can get the equilibrium. I can get it down to equilibrium, which is about 12% in my area, mine as well. If I then put it in an outbuilding that is warmed by the sun, I can sometimes get it down to 9 to 10% just by air drying. When I buy kiln dried lumber and then let it sit around, it typically comes back up to 9 to 10% in my shop. So in terms of being dry, my air-dried lumber should be dry enough to use. I prefer air-dried because I like the color variation and I think it's easier to work. I agree with you. My question is simply about bugs. What other people who air-dry lumber do, what do other people who air-dry lumber do to sterilize for bugs? I could take my air-dried lumber to a local kiln, but then I fear it would lose the benefits of air-dried lumber. I considered building a heat box so that I could put my air-dried lumber in it and heat it to the required 140 degrees for 48 hours. But I'm not sure what effect this would have on the qualities that I like about my air-dried lumber. So let's stop right here and break that down. Last part first. If you build a heat box and bring it up to temperature for 48 hours, that's called kiln drying. Any issues that you're going to see with your white oak that you like with air drying are going to go away. It doesn't matter that it's 48 hours. That's generally what a kiln cycle is. We bring it up to 48 hours and hold it there in order to get our fumigation certification. The kiln schedule does not call for 48 hours at that temperature. You don't need that long in order to kiln dry. You need a while to get it up there and you need a while to get it down, but you don't have to hold it at that high temperature. You're only doing that to kill the bugs. So let's go back a little bit further into walnut. He likes the working properties of air-dried lumber. It's easy to work. I agree. As a hand tool user, air-dried lumber is a dream to work with. The color aspect, certainly some kiln drying can leach some of the extractives. It can kind of dull things out as the lumber is baked, but you still retain a fair bit of color just by kiln drying walnut. Where the color is usually subdued in walnut is because it is steamed. That is a different process that specifically seeks to blend out the heartwood, take those extractives and kind of wash them into the sapwood so that the sapwood is not quite as creamy, but also the line between heart and sap is not quite as defined. It kind of blurs the edges. That's what pulls a lot of that color variation out of the heartwood is the steaming process. I'm not going to say that kiln drying doesn't do that, but to a much, 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 much less extent. So you could build a heat box, aka a kiln, or you could take it to someone to have it kiln dried. You would lose the working properties. Once you drop the temperature down in a kiln, you're going to harden the cell walls, and that's that working property that you like, the unhardened nature of the cell wall. Let's go back further into your question. He talks about drying it out in the open, and it gets to 12%. His equilibrium is 12%. If he sticks it in a heated room, it drops even further to 9 to 10%, but then it's just going to come back up again. So if you're air drying lumber, there's no reason to then put it in a heated room and drop it below your EMC. If you know what your equilibrium moisture content is, that's what you want it to be at. It's dry enough to work. Frankly, it's dry enough to work when it's substantially wetter than that, honestly. If it's above 25%, that's a bit of an issue. But it all depends on what you're building with it, right? And how you're doing, what kind of joiner and how thick you're going to cut it. There's so many other factors there. The point is, if you've air dried it to EMC, don't dry it anymore. There's every possibility that as you dry it lower, it's going to come, it will come back up to your EMC. And as you're drying, you're just introducing more stress into the board. You're shrinking the fibers unnaturally below EMC, and then they're ballooning back up to EMC. That's like, frost heaving. It tears up roads when water expands and it cracks up the asphalt. That's what you're doing. You're essentially forcing extra tension into the wood. So don't do that. If you're going with air dry, don't try to get it any lower. Get it to your EMC and don't worry. The problem with air dried is it's going to be much more prone to shoot up as a storm comes through. It'll go up to 15, 18% as, we get a couple of days of rain. Now it will drop back down, but it'll drop back down slower. If you put it in a kiln, you will harden those cell walls and they'll shed moisture. They'll be a little bit more water resistant. That's the real key difference there. So let's get into the bug thing. He says, how do other people store lumber in such a way that the bugs do not get in it? So the place I've been storing it is an old milk house. The building is dry and warm in the summer, which is nice because the lumber slowly gets a bit more dry than it would be outside. Again, you don't need to do that. You're adding stress. So the slabs that he did of walnut were dried down to 10%. Then they got bugs in them. I can't identify them, they're sure, but it's some sort of boring beetle. This makes me frustrated because I put the English walnut inside after a different pile of ash stored outside was infected by the different kind of beetle. Are you sure it was a different one or was it the same one? I don't know. But that's also a potentiality. You might have to quarantine some lumber if you'd find beetles, but you also have to be cautious and look very closely if you've segregated that species that it didn't bring the beetles with it, which it sounds like it may have. But I was concerned because I had already dried this lumber to EMC and blower. In doing some research, the bugs there are bugs that will attack even dried lumber that is 5% moisture content. This is absolutely true. The dryness of the wood shouldn't really affect whether or not a bug will attack it. The bug is going for food. It's the sugars in the wood. Now, kiln drying can reduce the sugars, can reduce some of the hemicellulose, but that's really thermally modified wood that's removing that. That's a different type of modification. It's a much, much higher temperature, usually above 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal kiln drying doesn't go that high and it's not going to bake out those sugars. The sugar is still there even when the lumber is at 0% or 5%, and the bugs are going to go for that. Now, most of the sugar will be in your sapwood, but you will find some in heartwood. And as I've said before, without another food source, the bugs are going to go for whatever. Like their world is that board that they're living in. And if they eat their way through the sapwood, it's not like they go, okay, Vern, we're all out. Let's go find another board. They don't know that there's another board. Their entire universe is that board. So they just keep eating. And when they run out of sapwood, they'll keep eating. It's like, do you keep eating that nice juicy pork chop do you go after the Brussels sprouts on your plate when you still have juicy pork chop left? Me personally, I love Brussels sprouts, but you get the idea. You're going to continue eating the juicy pork chop before you, swallow those Brussels sprouts that maybe were overcooked. I don't like overcooked Brussels sprouts. That's what's going on here. I'm reminded, I think it was a South Park episode about lice, and they told the story from the perspective of the lice, and like the lice living in this one kid's head, like that was their universe. They didn't know there was another kid that they could just, we've eaten all the, what do they eat? I don't know. We've used up our natural resources of this kid's head. Let's go find another kid's head. No, it's like saying, 400 years ago, we've used up all the resources on this planet. Let's go find another planet. We didn't know we had other planets. Well, we did 400 years ago, but you get the point. These bugs don't know that there's another board. They will keep eating regardless of moisture content. So he says, let's say it did kill the bugs in the wood with my heat experiment. What is to keep more bugs from coming in? So we've established that, you dried it and you killed the bugs, but they're still going to come back. So again, it's not the dryness that killed them, it's the heat that killed them. So we can dry wood by bringing it up to 140 degrees, slowly up to 140 degrees, maybe leaving it there for 5 minutes and then bringing it back down. That's what you're doing to dry it. We're holding it at 140 degrees or sometimes higher, depending upon the bug, to kill the bugs. So if you dry the lumber, say you get rid of the bugs, you dry the lumber, yes, the bugs can come back. The only way to prevent the bugs from coming back from a heat perspective is to maintain that high heat. That's not efficient. That just sounds awful. You have to figure out what's attracting the bugs in the first place. Were your trees felled in summer and spring? Do they have a lot of sap in them? Do they have a lot of sugar in them? Or are they particularly tasty? That's a strong possibility. This is why we fell trees in the winter, preferably, worst case, fall, when the sap is not rising. You will have a tree, a board, that is less attracted to bugs. But what you really need to do is treat your boards with a borate solution. And I've known a lot of people who've done this, and it's not going to affect the color of the wood or anything like that. This is for storage purposes. Probably what's going to happen, if you have that board of English walnut in your shed and you're going to build something with it now, you're going to bring it into your shop. So you probably bring it in your shop and you leave it there to kind of acclimate for a little bit. But the first thing you're going to do is start cutting that. You're probably going to plane that board. In fact, the first thing I would do is start cutting it into smaller parts because it will acclimate faster in smaller parts than in one big giant slab. Pro tip. Fastest way to flatten a board is with a saw, folks. Don't just leave it around and let it cup to acclimate. Cut it down into parts, grab your parts list, start cutting it down. It will dry a lot faster. So if you've got a borate solution that's been put on there to keep the bugs away, and people are like, well, is it going to affect my finish? Is it going to, dull my tools or anything like that? I don't think it would dull your tools. But the first thing you're going to do when you start building with that is probably plane away any borate solution on the surface. So get some borate, get some water, mix up a dilute solution. Actually, just look this up on Google. You'll find all kinds of solutions for this. Not all kinds. There's really not that much science to this. And put it in a spray bottle and spray the lumber, spray it wet and just let it dry. That borate will keep those bugs out of there. If there are bugs already in the board, I can't say that it will kill them. It'll help, but it may not get them all. So spray the boards with a borate solution and continue to observe and look for boreholes and frass or sawdust piles. If you see them, spray it again. Shoot it down in that hole. That's a great way to treat this stuff. So that's the important part, because he goes on to say, like, if I go and sterilize my lumber by heating it 140 degrees, what happens then? What happens then? You're always going to potentially get bugs back. They might be coming from the barn where you're storing them. That's a strong possibility. So he does just finish and say, what is the ideal lumber storage environment? I've cut down trees planted by my grandfather, go to all the work of milling and air drying and then sterilizing. Some of these are over 100 years old, so I want to store them without getting more bugs in them. So what would be the ideal environment? And I think you're not far off. You want something that is going to be dry. It doesn't necessarily have to be heated. Again, once it gets to EMC, the additional heat is only going to possibly introduce more stress as it heats up a lot. What you want, preferably, would be a constant temperature that's dry. But what's really missing from your current setup is ventilation. As the lumber is drying, you got to have ventilation. You got to have a fan blowing air across there, because what it's doing is evaporating the moisture. As the moisture rises to the surface, the dry air from the fan blows across it. It sucks up that moisture and it carries it out. It's called the dehumidifier. As that's drying, ventilation is absolutely important, because if you do not ventilate it, what are you going to get? Wet boards that are going to grow mold. And that's a bigger issue. Well, maybe not bigger issue than bugs, but that's just as nasty an issue. You've got to ventilate it. And it's not just a matter of opening a window. You need to have an active air current blowing across those boards, which is why we sticker boards, to allow space between the boards for the air to flow through and to evaporate off that moisture. Once those boards have hit EMC, you still want to make sure that it's pretty well ventilated, because especially in central PA, where the humidity is high, that barn rises up to 95 degrees, 100 degrees, probably 110 degrees because it's a closed, environment in the summer. The relative humidity can go up as well. The hotter the air, the more moisture it can hold. Well, if the humidity outside is 80%, the temperature goes up, you're going to get a pressure gradient. You're actually going to get wind as moisture comes in, as the hotter air wants to suck up more moisture. It's going to suck up that moisture. You're going to have really, really hot, wet air on top of your boards. So you're going to constantly have to have ventilation, evaporating. Well, it is cooling. It's called evaporative cooling. The adiabatic effect. Well, that's a little bit different. It has to do with topography. Never mind. We're not going to get into meteorology discussion. We get geeky enough on this show. You have to have that air moving across it. So the ideal environment would be constant temperature, where maybe you don't have to ventilate as much. That's like not cryogenic, like hermetically sealed. That's not going to work. A barn is a great place to be. It's out of the way. It can get warm, but you've got to keep it ventilated. And the perfect place will never be set it and forget it. You've always got to be looking for bugs. The first sign you see of bugs, get at that borate solution and douse the boards. So that's the bigger thing. Don't necessarily look for the perfect place to store them. Put it on your calendar, put a recurring reminder on your phone. Go check the boards this week. Go check the boards once a month. Don't just leave it up there and expect they're going to be fine. And I can tell you, I have bought lumber, and I know a lot of people who've bought lumber from like grandpa's attic. They always have bug problems because grandpa stuck it up there and didn't think about it for 30 years, 20 years, and the bugs will get to it. And what's happened is they're dead stacked, meaning no stickers, board on top of board. They're dead stacked, which doesn't allow, and they're not ventilated. So the moisture builds up there. You get mold growing, which the bugs love the mold. It's sugar. They're going to go be attracted to that, and they're going to eat the mold, and they're going to go, what's next, Vern? Well, let's eat this wood. And that's what happens. Ventilation is going to keep the moisture content constant-ish, and it's going to prevent the growth of stuff that's going to attract the bugs. So I hope that helps. That's a really long answer. It was a really long question and a great question. Joshua has obviously done a lot of kind of research on his own. He's tried a lot of stuff, and I understand he's put a lot of work into this English walnut, and he wants it to be usable, for him and maybe even the next generation. So the perfect answer is you got to stay on top of it. I hope that helps, Joshua. Thank you for those questions. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the depth of detail you put in those questions. Maybe it was a little bit weird for me to read. I didn't read all of them, but anytime you guys ask a question, I love to see that you've done your own research. So while we're on that topic, if you got questions, I've said this before, go to lumberupdate.com, hit me up at lumberupdate@gmail.com. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment below this video, or find me on Instagram at Lumber Update Show. And stay tuned for the next couple episodes. I'm not exactly sure the timing on this, but we're going to continue to dive into figured species. And maybe, even though no one quite knows why figure happens, maybe if we put our heads together, we can solve it for them, right? All these scientists haven't done it. A bunch of, woodworking lumber geeks listening to a podcast will probably solve that problem. Maybe not. If you are a Patreon supporter at the walnut level, you will be getting the fancy Tamo Ash sticker. I'll be mailing those out. If you become a walnut tier sponsor in the month of August, you will get this sticker. So you've got until midnight on the 31st of August. I had to figure out, are there 30 or 31 days in August? I still have to do that little count my knuckles thing sometimes to figure out how many days there are in a month. You have until the 31st of August. If you become a sponsor at that level before the 31st is up, you will get the sticker. I will mail it out to you. Even if I have to mail it on the 2nd of September, you're going to get it. And again, thank you for continuing to support the show. Patreon.com/lumberupdate is where you do that. That's where you sign up to get those fancy stickers in the mail. And for those of you who've been asking, coming very soon, you will have the ability to purchase back stickers. I've got a lot of collectors out there who are like, damn it, I gotta have the cherry sticker. I gotta have the walnut sticker. I gotta complete my set. I'm itching. It's coming very soon. Thank you for listening, everybody. Go pick up some Tamo Ash veneer and let me know what you think of it. And let me know what you build with it, because it is cool species. Really, really exciting, varied figure. It is a unique wood to veneer with. See you next time.